Bradley Beal trade talks are heating up, and the Phoenix Suns reportedly one of the top suitors. What just happened? We'll break it all down. Everything you need to know about Beal to Phoenix on today's bonus episode of Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons, a writer at Suns.com, and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen here on this Saturday afternoon. Yeah, I don't normally record on Saturday afternoons, but that's what you get when you subscribe to Locked On Suns. We are free and available on all podcast platforms, and we're here for you every single weekday, as well as the occasional insane Saturday episode to react to off-season shenanigans. I don't think there's anything really else that you would ever call this. But here nonetheless, Bradley Beal, the Shams bomb, I don't know what we call those, dropped 10 o'clock or so Phoenix time on Saturday. And apparently Bradley Beal wants to come to the Suns. And the reason that him wanting to come is even relevant, or that it's even known, is that the man has a no-trade clause. So let's dive into every permutation of a trade, if he fits here, and what it would all look like. Today's show, guys, brought to you by the Game Time app. Create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off your first purchase. That's last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed with Game Time. More from them later on in the show. So we have to start with me apologizing to all of you, the everydayers who have listened to this show throughout the week. You know that I poo-pooed this, kind of rolled my eyes, just completely shook it off earlier in the week when it became clear that the Wizards were revving up the engines on a Beal trade. And I'll be honest, I guess maybe part of my lack of taking it seriously came from the fact that I just don't think it's really what the best thing for the Suns to do. I don't think it's the best thing for the Suns to do. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, I'll talk to you more about why. Maybe you already remember why if you did listen to that show, but the bottom line is it doesn't matter what I think. That being said, so Shams says that they're a serious threat. John Gambadoro has confirmed that. You had Chris Haynes from Bleacher Report and TNT later saying that either, a little bit hard to decipher the tweet, but either Beal or Washington prefers the Chris Paul trade. Maybe both. I don't know. We'll talk about the way that would work in a minute. But the really most interesting part here is on two fronts, from The Athletic and from Mark Stein of the Steinline newsletter. So David Aldridge and Josh Robbins from The Athletic Washington both reported about an hour ago. I'm recording at around 3 p.m. Hopefully nothing breaks as I'm talking to you guys. That according to league sources, Miami, who obviously has been the most reported suitor all along, that Miami would offer a package centered on Kyle Lowry, Duncan Robinson, and, quote, multiple first-round picks. And then the Phoenix options are either Deandre Ayton and cap filler or Chris Paul and cap filler to the Wizards for Beal. So that is pretty straightforward. I'll talk about each of those in a moment. From a timing standpoint, and I guess to give some perspective as to why this came out now, Mark Stein had it that basically the reason Washington is looking to do this so quickly and that this has all heated up so fast, seemingly, is that the Wizards want to get a deal done before Damian Lillard potentially becomes available. And if the Blazers can't find a trade for the number 3 overall pick that makes Lillard happy, and they go ahead and trade for Scoot Henderson or draft Scoot Henderson or do whatever it is that Portland might do, then suddenly Lillard becomes much more desirable for Washington, and the market for Beal, as small as those two Miami and Phoenix offers in that Athletic report already might seem to you, and you're right that they're already pretty paltry, they would get even less aggressive if Lillard was an option. Probably not for the Suns, but definitely for the Heat, because the Heat have, a real Godfather type of offer that they can make with picks and hero and whatever it might be. That's a team that would just pivot, and likely other teams that might pursue Beal that we maybe haven't heard of would also pivot to Lillard. He's just a better player, and they cost about the same. So, to me, the Wizards should absolutely prioritize that Miami deal. It includes first-round picks. I mean, that just in and of itself is, I think, what matters here. You want, if you are a resetting, rebuilding team like the Wizards clearly would become if they moved on from Beal, what you want is picks. You want to get your own pick better by being bad, and you want to accumulate as many additional picks as you possibly can get. I mean, that is how this stuff works. That's how the Jazz and the Thunder and whatever other team you want to list off, that is what rebuilding looks like in the NBA. It does not look like getting Chris Paul or even buying him out, because again, what really would cap space even accomplish for the Wizards? They're not going to be wanting to sign a player this summer or sign a player next summer. They're wanting to bottom out. There's no need to have cap space. You can use some cap space for some trades and whatnot, so I don't think the Chris Paul thing is ridiculous, but it's certainly not the best pathway, and neither is Deandre Ayton. I mean, what good is it to have a center? This is where my podcast earlier in the week really focused, was there just doesn't seem to be a trade possibility between Phoenix and Washington to get Beal that makes any sense for the Wizards. What I did not realize or think about deeply enough is what happens if Beal just decides, I want to be in Phoenix no matter what. That is the only place I want to be. That is the only trade I will sign off on. My no trade clause will be used for all of the other 29 teams except for Phoenix. Then the Wizards have to accept whatever it is that the Suns offer. They don't have to trade him, so that's the last little bit of leverage that the Wizards have here. But if it's not going to be a Miami deal, then really it just comes down to negotiations between Washington and Phoenix, and that's a situation where you could see them accepting Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, and 5 second-round picks, and then they cut Chris Paul, cut Shamet next summer, and they move on with some cap space, some second-round picks, and they wave goodbye to the Bradley Beal era. That would be pretty bad for Wizards fans, but none of you guys listening are probably Wizards fans, so I guess it doesn't so much matter. So let's talk about what trades would look like from a cap standpoint. I mean, that's what the packages would be. I don't think we need to discuss much deeper than that. That's, David Aldridge, a legendary NBA reporter, telling you exactly what the offers are. I don't think there's really much more to discuss, but for either of those trades to happen, what would that look like? And as far as Beal getting here, what would that look like? Because you're talking about one of the biggest 3-player cap hits that the league would have in an era where we're supposedly headed toward teams cutting money. Let's talk about that all next. First, today's show brought to you by Bird Dogs. Bird Dogs are the comfiest, softest, stretchiest shorts that I personally have ever worn. They gave all of us here at the Locked On Podcast Network an awesome sample, and I have been able to try them out for myself to confirm unequivocally to all of you that they are worth it. They are the real deal. And look, we all live in Phoenix, or most of you listening live in Arizona, and when it's hot, sticky, sweaty, you just want breathable, stretchable, good-looking shorts to be out in your day without feeling underdressed, without feeling overly cramped, and you just want to be able to roll with it. Bird Dogs gets you all the way there. It exceeds expectations. It's perfect for anyone living in the Arizona sun. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA to try it for yourself and get a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That promo code, that select specific special URL, birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA gets you that free Yeti-style tumbler when you try Bird Dogs for yourself. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. Okay, so Bradley Beal makes $47 million this year, and it goes as high as, I believe, around 60 by the end. We won't talk about the end of it because that's a conversation for a different day if and when the trade actually ever happened. He makes $57.1 million in 2026, but that's not the point right now. The point right now is that he makes 47. And so let's establish that. Let's talk about Chris Paul. You know the deal with Chris Paul's salary by now, which is that it is about half guaranteed. It's guaranteed for about $16 of $31 million. The trick is, with guaranteed and non-guaranteed and partially guaranteed salaries in the league these days, players with partial guarantees only count in trades for the amount of their guarantee. So Chris Paul right now, and that phrase right now is key, but right now, Chris Paul would only count as $15.8 million of outgoing salary in a trade. And so right now, a Chris Paul, Landry Shamet, even if you include campaign in there as salary, it's not legal. It doesn't work. It doesn't meet the salary cap rules. However, as far as I know, and that phrase is also key because I'm not by any means a Bobby Marks style cap expert, who you might remember from all the ESPN work that he does on Woj's pod and everything else. Bobby Marks would probably maybe be able to tell me if I'm right or wrong. As far as I know, Chris Paul could easily just have that contract guaranteed because that is just up to the Suns. That's not a player option. That's not Chris Paul choosing to guarantee his contract. That is the Suns. They could just go ahead and say, all right, he is now making $38.8 million. That entire amount is going to be guaranteed. And now that entire amount becomes his number in a trade. And then at that point, a Paul plus Shamet or a Paul plus Shamet plus Payne trade does work under the salary cap rules. All right. So that is just to understand what types of situations we might be looking at. That's also important just because, again, from the Wizards' standpoint, they're not going to really keep Chris Paul. I don't see what benefit that would give to them. It's not even like they have young players that they're trying to develop. They are basically starting from scratch. So it's not a situation like, oh, well, Chris Paul can help our young guys and he can be sort of our floor general for this 1 year before we cut him. Or no, he would probably just be waived and stretched pretty immediately. And again, the main benefit there for Washington would be cap space. Not, again, that who cares once Chris Paul's gone? I guess Suns fans maybe don't care, but just so you know, from a negotiating standpoint, that's where things would stand. On to what it would look like if Beal got here. And this is going to matter from the Suns standpoint in negotiations, all right? Kellen Olson added up the numbers. I believe others did as well, but you're basically looking at Beal, Booker, and Durant combined, just the three of them this upcoming season would make a combined $131 million, all right? If you add DeAndre Ayton to that, you're looking at $163 million, okay? Next season, not the one that starts in October, but the one that starts the following October. You're talking about $151 million for Beal, Booker, and Durant because that is the season when Booker's Supermax kicks in. The extension that he signed last summer still doesn't even kick in this year. It actually kicks in next year, a full 2 years after he actually signed it. So that's why that jump goes up to 151. And with Ayton, that goes to 186. And then the following year after that, which is the last year of Ayton's contract, 163 for Beal, Booker, and Durant. Add Ayton in there, and you're at 198. The reason all of that is relevant is because, once again, as I mentioned briefly in that first segment, the second apron this year, which is the new second sort of tier of punishment that teams receive depending on how much they spend, that number, that benchmark is $179.5 million. Giving the Suns, if they were to make a deal of Paul and Shamet for Beal, let's say, which is the one that The Athletic is telling us that they would make if this were to come to be, it gives the Suns less than $17 million under that second apron if they include Ayton still on their roster, if they still had him on their team. It could be less if they were to do a separate Ayton deal and cut more money. You know, could you do an Ayton deal and he makes about 32? Could you bring back 28? And then, okay, there's $4 more million of flexibility with other moves. Easier said than done, but that's obviously an option here. The last option, and my opinion is this is how the Suns are currently seeing this. Some people like John Hollinger have kind of brought this idea up on Twitter since the article, since the report came out about the Suns pursuing Beal, is that the Suns see this as maybe a pathway to also getting a little more depth. And so it would basically be a combination of Beal, but also what I talked about earlier in the week regarding the Suns not so much pursuing Beal, although again, I was wrong there, but more looking to the Wizards for what can they get in more of an opportunistic buy low type of way from Washington's roster. Because remember, not only do the Wizards have Kyle Kuzma, who has a player option for about $13 million that teams are reportedly that he's expected to turn down. You could include him in some way, shape, or form, a sign-in trade, or maybe he opts in at the $13 million and then gets extended by the Suns. There's all sorts of options there, but also Daniel Gafford, who's like a pretty solid center, role player center. Denny Avdia and Corey Kispert, who are recent Wizards draft picks, who could provide some depth on the wing for the Suns, and then veteran guards in both DeLon Wright and Monte Morris, who make about $8 million or so, who the Suns could possibly try to get there. That type of pathway, whether it was something as big as Kuzma or something as small as Corey Kispert, if you start to add that stuff onto it, you get to a situation where the Suns could possibly include all three of Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton, and Landry Shamet in the trade. And there's also versions there where you could actually trade Chris Paul prior to guaranteeing him, let the Wizards decide on what they want to do with that ahead of his June 28th deadline. Count his salary as just the guarantee, which is about $16 million. But then you have Ayton at 32-ish, 31, and Shamet at 10, 11. Then you're getting to a situation where you can do a Beal plus Kispert, Beal plus Avdia, Beal plus DeLon Wright, Beal plus Kuzma at that $13 million, and it starts to work a little better. My view right now is that the Suns probably see it making more sense for them if it includes that as well. Thinking of it as a little bit of a 2-for-1, right? I don't know if they get there. That feels very greedy. That feels very far-fetched at this current moment. But when you remember that Beal wants to be in Phoenix, if this becomes the no doubt destination that he wants, the ball is in the Suns' court and they start to have a lot more leverage. That would be an ability to basically get a third star and depth. I have been talking about the pathways for the Suns this offseason being one or the other. If the Suns are able to accomplish both in one trade, I personally could be swayed on that. And I also think it just makes a lot more sense. It just starts to have value in a way that might make it worth doing. Let's talk about Beal's fit in Phoenix. I have 3 questions for you. I have one stat from a basketball writer that I found that I think really matters here. And then I'll tell you where I come down on all of this and if I would do it. First, today's show brought to you by the Game Time app. I'm looking at their website now, and they have tickets available for the College World Series, which is ongoing. They have local baseball, wherever you might be, concerts, comedy, theater, all of it. Game Time is the place for last-minute tickets, so forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on all your favorite sports and shows. The Game Time guarantee also means you'll always get the best price. Which means if you find tickets in the same section and row for less than what you bought them for on Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. They have a ton of things that make it easy, efficient, and quick to buy your tickets without a lot of hassle. Snag the tickets without the stress at Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I mean, look, you and your family, you and a +1, $20 off could get you the majority of your first purchase. Baseball tickets, those things can be cheap, especially day of. That is a big discount. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Closing out our bonus show as I click back and forth on Twitter to make sure that there is no trade being broken as I'm telling you what I think of the trade. But let's talk about how Bradley Beal might actually fit in Phoenix. He has an interesting situation. And this is another part of why I just didn't think it was worth doing. Are there some third stars that you could maybe convince me are worth trying to go out and get if they want to come here? And I told you Beal is not an absolute no from me. I'm not trying to gloss over that he's a good player, but there are some third stars who I think could make sense if there was a world in which the Suns could realistically get James Harden. I haven't talked about that a lot because I don't think there's a realistic world where that happens. But if there was, sure, I think he could fit. It's not what I would choose to do, but I think he would be pretty solid here, you know? Bradley Beal is not one of those players in a vacuum simply because his efficiency has fallen off, his productivity has fallen off, and his health has fallen off in such a way that I just think is a bad combination for somebody who is going to be making as much money as he's going to make. Now, at the same time that I say that, I can readily and easily admit to you that the past 3 seasons, when he has played 150 games out of a possible, I want to say like 230-something, 240-something, which is, you know, less than 2/3. Some of that is because they've not been competitive. They have not been trying to win that much. And he did not get vaccinated for the COVID-19. Against, there's the word I'm looking for. And I'm not trying to sit here and have a whole long diatribe about the pros and cons of vaccination. We're not doing that show. We're not doing public health or political podcasts here. But the point is, he missed a lot of time as a result. When he got COVID, it seemed to hit him harder than others, which is what happens. And therefore, he had 3 separate instances with COVID over the past 2 seasons alone. Actually, 3 seasons. He had it in January of 2021, shortly after the first COVID season, the year the Suns went to the finals. I don't know how long it kept him out, but a couple weeks from what it looks like. He then had it again in December of the following season, about 2 months after that season started, and he missed, I want to say 3 weeks, and then he had it again in November of this most recent season that actually just finished, which was pretty rare. Not a lot of players had it this past year, but he did in November, right after the season started. So that's just a caveat to say when people tell you, well, he only played 60 of 72 games. The Suns' finals year, he only played 40, the 64-win season for Phoenix, and he only played 50 last year. Well, yeah, I would say a couple dozen of those misses were related to COVID, which a lot of players had, and Beal's going to have had more as a result. So that is a little bit of an alleviation of the health concerns. And the other part of it is, I don't know the dude's medicals. I'm not here to try to tell you anything about said medicals, but it just hasn't been the same thing keeping him out for long stretches of time. And I just don't, he had a wrist thing toward the end of the 21-22 season. That was the majority of the time that he missed, but it doesn't seem like that has flared up all that much. He had a hamstring thing that kept him out for, or that bothered him for a month or two this most recent season. Those are serious, but I mean, he's only 30 and Devin Booker just had hamstring and groin things that kept him out for almost half of the year. Does that mean that Devin Booker is an injury concern? I don't think we would describe him that way. So it doesn't feel fair to describe Beal that way. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little less worried about the health part of this. I'm more worried about the production and the efficiency parts of this. And the stat that I mentioned in that last segment is from Zach Cram at The Ringer, where he said over the last 3 seasons, Bradley Beal has shot just 34% on 3-pointers. That ranks 100th out of 109 players who have taken at least 800 threes over that span. 2 years ago, Bradley Beal only made 30% of his threes, and he took 210 of them. The previous year, he took almost 400 of them, and he only made 35%. He was an all-star that season, but was not all that efficient from deep. Now, fortunately for him, he is a killer from two-point range. He has shot over 50% from two-point range every year since 2016. He is a very good free throw shooter, and he actually gets to the free throw line quite a bit. He is also a pretty solid playmaker who does not turn the ball over a lot. So you add that all up, and despite being a weak defender, he is somebody who, on average, is a positive in the catch-all statistics across that the NBA uses in a pretty considerable direction toward the positive. You know, a box plus minus of 3.3 in 2016, 3.4 in that year that he made the All-Star team when the Suns made the finals. Some pretty genuinely valuable seasons despite some recent shooting problems and the lack of defense. That is a really good offensive player. And so my questions about Beal, as I said, I have 3 of them. Number 1, do the Suns see him as a second guard next to Booker or a second wing next to Booker where they still look into a more traditional point guard in the starting lineup? Now, we never know how teams will close. It's not time for that yet. But I think that question matters because it determines how big you are. And especially with Frank Vogel as the coach now, and it's just in general in the modern NBA, the biggest teams tend to get the furthest. The Celtics, the Heat, the Nuggets, the Warriors, even now that Kevon Looney plays more, the Bucks, the teams that are the biggest and most versatile with their size tend to be the best in the league right now. Bradley Beal as your 2 guard and Devin Booker as your small forward, so to speak. That's 2 guys at 6'4", 6'5", with not a huge wingspan and not a lot of defensive, athletic stopper potential, plus a point guard who's going to probably be even smaller than those guys. You start to just get worried about the defense, no matter who those guys are, but especially considering Beal and Booker are, I think Booker's a good defender at best. I think Beal's more like an average defender at best. That's not really what you want with another small guy in there on top of that. Number 2, can he, as we're just discussing, leads us right into it, can Beal be anything more than a neutral defender? And I think probably not. He's 30 years old, and even if you think the wrist and the hamstring stuff is not going to linger, the reality is he's somebody who has started to deal with some I'm using the word lingering after I just said it would not linger, some consistent injury problems, even if they're not all connected to one another. Guy on the wrong side of his prime who already has had a few small injuries, I doubt you're going to have him get some, rejuvenation and career year as a defender. Last question is, can Beal ever live up to his contract at 47 all the way to 57 over the next 4 seasons, millions of dollars, if all he is for you is a third option / shooter? And this is the most important question, and I think the most complicated answer, actually, because I think the obvious thing, it's a very leading question, you know where I'm going with it, is probably not. He probably cannot live up to that contract, quote unquote. He's not going to, the 538 does that, salary, what he's going to be worth from a salary standpoint over the next X number of years, and there's all sorts of ways to calculate that. And I don't think Beal would ever pop out as telling you, yeah, this guy's worth 47, 49, 51, 53, 55, whatever, millions of dollars. No way. But the Suns' specific situation might mean that their only way of getting an above-average third option is to trade for Beal under the specific set of circumstances that result in Beal having this no-trade clause and choosing to come to Phoenix, right? It's one thing to say, well, you could probably get a guy who does a lot of what Beal does for cheaper, but the Suns don't have the assets and the pathways to go out and get that player. So let's dream up what that third option might be. Pick anybody in the NBA who you feel like would be an ideal third banana next to what it is that Booker and Durant already do as players. Is it Cade Cunningham? Is it Mikal Bridges? Is it Darius Garland? Whatever you think. Marcus Smart? The Suns aren't not getting any of those players. The Suns are not getting anybody even close to as good as those players. If all their trade chips are at this particular point in time is Chris Paul's expiring $31 million at age 38 or DeAndre Ayton's max that he has not lived up to. You're not getting that third option, right? So that's where I get it. And maybe I get it is the most positive that I'm able to go here, but I guess that's enough to at least get in on these talks. And so where I come down is it makes sense to explore this if you can get him for as little as it seems. But you have to nail the secondary move, whether that's Ayton also going to Washington, which wouldn't necessarily be a secondary move, but a secondary part of the Beal move. If he also goes to Washington and you're able to get some of their role players, I could be convinced of that. Or you make a separate DeAndre Ayton trade to cut some salary and get a little bit more depth. Those two options I can roll with. I could be convinced that that taken in totality results in the best team for the Suns next season. If it's Ayton stays on the team and you're super expensive and you're filling out the roster with minimums, if it is that you trade Ayton for more expensive players who don't really make the team that much better and they're not very good, I think the Suns could do better by just simply trading Paul and or Ayton or stretching Paul, as we've talked about, and getting a great player, a great fit, a great role player at the mid-level. That's when I would start to think that pathway is better, where you do not get Beal. Those are the two things. That's the fork that the Suns are standing at in the road. We will likely know more very soon because the Wizards seem to want to get this done. But that'll wrap us up for now. Maybe another bonus episode by the time I get back to you. We'll have to see. But hit follow or hit subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. We're free and available everywhere. You'll get more shows throughout draft week, free agency week, and beyond every single day if you hit that button. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.